We are accustomed to thinking that the sinking of the giant transatlantic liner was simply the greatest tragic accident of the early 20th century. From school benches, we are fed this touching fairy tale, a fatal confluence of circumstances, the unforgivable mistake of an overly confident captain, the lack of binoculars for the lookouts, a suddenly descending thick fog, and finally, the blind and merciless force of nature embodied in an insurmountable iceberg. For decades, this story has been shown to us in high-budget films, making us cry over fictional romances and admire the courage of musicians playing until the very end on the tilting deck. We have been made to believe in a beautiful myth that humanity's technological hubris simply shattered against indomitable nature. But the deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture became.
If we set aside the Hollywood tears, strip away all the romantic fluff, and look at the dry facts, laws, dates, and the invisible movement of vast global capital flows, the official version crumbles. There is absolutely no mysticism here, no curses of ancient artifacts or unexplained phenomena, only cold logic, ruthless economics, and the cool-headed elimination of competitors in a global battle for power. Ask yourself one very simple but extremely painful question. Doesn't it seem strange to you that we spend our entire conscious lives obligated to pay tax on our own labor? You wake up every morning, go to work, spend your irreplaceable time, health, and vital energy to create some value. Yet by law, you are required to hand over a substantial portion of your earnings to a vast, insatiable black hole. You give your money to nowhere, without even wondering why the system is structured this way, and who these colossal monetary flows really go to. We have grown accustomed to this everyday financial bondage, like the change of seasons or bad weather. We are told that it is absolutely necessary for our own good, for maintaining the state, for building roads and hospitals. But what if I tell you that this invisible noose around the neck of every working person was tightened not in bright government offices by the will of a free people, but became a direct consequence of that very cold night in the icy waters? To grasp the true scale of how we were all deceived, you need to forever link your current paycheck to the icy waters of the Atlantic in 1912. We live in a harsh reality, designed for us by ruthless banking cartels and hidden elites, and the foundation of this debt-based reality was laid on the bones of those few who tried to stand in their way. What if the iceberg was merely a convenient backdrop for the most massive financial coup in human history? Starting from this chilling sensation of a grand deception, we begin to unravel the tight knot in which the fates of the planet's richest people and the future of the entire world economy are inextricably intertwined. Think about it. How can you seize absolute power over the entire world so that no one even realizes total enslavement has occurred? If you come with weapons, people will eventually rise up. If you declare yourself an eternal dictator, you will eventually be overthrown. But if you change the very nature of money, if you take away the state's sovereign right to create it and hand that right over to an extremely narrow circle of private individuals, you become invisible and invulnerable rulers of the world. You can then finance world wars with impunity, sponsor global crises, buy politicians by the party, and hold entire future generations hostage. It was precisely such a plan for ultimate takeover that matured in the minds of the leaders of transnational corporations and bankers at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And in order for this unprecedented plan to come to life without a hitch, they needed to pull off an operation so audacious and shocking that no one in their right mind could suspect malice. A massive tragedy is the perfect screen for concealing the crime of the millennium. When millions of people in horror read about the sinking floating palace, when newspaper front pages blaze with screaming headlines about children and women frozen in the ocean. No one will scrupulously examine financial reports or check the lists of those who so conveniently didn't have seats in the lifeboats.
No one in the heat of universal grief will start asking uncomfortable questions about why the main political and financial opponents of the looming banking dictatorship found themselves locked in a steel trap in the middle of the ocean, while the initiators of that dictatorship stayed on safe shores, sipping expensive cognac. We begin our large-scale investigation, step by step, lancing this historical abscess. And I can promise you, with full confidence, that by its end, you will never be able to look at familiar things through the same eyes again. The foolish illusion of randomness will completely dissolve, giving way to a terrifying understanding of how perfectly, methodically, and cruelly the machine of global control operates. My task in this investigation is not to scare you with empty theories, but to make your mind work. We will rely exclusively on historical facts, confirmed chronologies, and economic laws that still operate in the United States of America and around the world. We will trace the path from conception to execution, from the first secret negotiations to the signing of laws that forever deprived us of freedom. Step by step, we will prove that what happened on that fateful night was not a random navigation error. It was the first phase of a grand takeover, a meticulously planned action that changed the course of world history. And to understand exactly how this global cage slammed shut, we will have to rewind time a bit. We will have to go back to where it all began, to the deep secret hidden from prying eyes, several years before the first steel plate was laid at the shipbuilders' yards. Let's transport ourselves to November 1910. To understand the true scale of the impending tragedy, we need to examine in detail the very place where its solid foundation was laid. Jekyll Island, located off the coast of the state of Georgia, became the venue for an absolutely secret meeting about which the press knew not a word. Under the cover of a dark night, in an atmosphere of utmost secrecy, the most influential financiers and representatives of banking cartels secretly gathered in a luxurious hunting club. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture of this hidden conspiracy became. In those times, the world was radically different from our current reality. It was a world of genuine financial autonomy, where national currencies had strict gold backing. Money represented real value, a tangible measure of human labor, not just pieces of paper that could be endlessly created out of thin air. The state and citizens possessed economic independence that could not be easily subordinated to the whims of invisible elites. But it was precisely this freedom that was the main obstacle for those who craved absolute monopoly on power. On the isolated Jekyll Island, a handful of ruthless people coldly developed a detailed plan for the total takeover of the world economy. The main goal was to create a private central bank that would masquerade as a government institution, but would be fully controlled by financial cartels. The idea was truly genius in its chilling cynicism. It required taking away from the United States government its sovereign right to print its own money, and permanently transferring that right into private hands. This would force an entire nation to borrow its own currency at ever-increasing interest rates. This meant uninterrupted control over markets, the ability to buy politicians wholesale, and keeping entire generations in check. This was no accident. It was strict mathematical calculation. The bankers perfectly understood that a direct, forceful seizure of power would inevitably provoke mass rebellion. So they decided to act exclusively through financial mechanisms, weaving an ultra-strong web of debt slavery. However, this flawless plan faced one critical and insurmountable problem. The hidden elite suddenly encountered the most powerful resistance from those who categorically refused to hand over the country's fate to a handful of monopolists.
It is here that three main heroes of the resistance enter the story. Three unwavering titans of the old economic school. John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. These were not just incredibly wealthy people. They were among the most affluent and powerful figures of their time, whose influence extended far beyond their businesses. Their capital was absolutely real, backed by factories, real estate, and actual gold, not dubious credit schemes. John Jacob Astor IV was a true visionary and real estate magnate whose authoritative word carried decisive weight. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to an industrial empire, firmly controlled massive production capacities. Isidor Straus, a supremely successful retail magnate, was renowned for his unwavering principled stance and enjoyed boundless respect in society. These three outstanding individuals possessed sufficient resources, connections, and colossal political influence to prevent the financial cage from slamming shut. They openly advocated for the independence of private capital and fiercely opposed the creation of a monopolistic printing press, clearly understanding the destructiveness of this scheme. For the ambitious creators of the new banking monopoly, Astor, Guggenheim, and Straus represented a primary mortal threat. These independent magnates stood like an immovable rock directly in the path of the global credit dictatorship, and it was absolutely impossible to bribe or intimidate them. They possessed sufficient financial and public authority to effortlessly block any bill in the United States government aimed at enslaving the economy. The official version crumbles to dust if we ignore this most important economic conflict of the early 20th century. The banking cartels clearly realized that as long as this influential trio remained alive and continued to defend the country's independence, the grand Jekyll Island plan was doomed to failure. An urgent necessity arose to permanently eliminate the main opponents. But this had to be done so thunderously loud that not the slightest suspicion would fall on the true masterminds. Mundane contract killings would trigger massive government investigations. They needed a perfect catastrophe, a grand, blind force of nature that the entire world would unconditionally believe. It was precisely at this pivotal historical moment that an ambitious project began taking shape on the world stage. The grandest, most luxurious, and incredibly expensive ship in all of human history. The initiators of the shadowy financial coup began meticulously preparing a flawless steel backdrop for mass liquidation. Diving into archival documents, I clearly saw how this monstrous trap was methodically constructed. A perfect and impeccably planned crime must never leave obvious evidence or direct witnesses behind. It must appear as an incredibly tragic coincidence. The banking cartels coldly prepared to deliver a devastating blow that would forever change the rules of the game on the planet. They only needed to lure all their key enemies into one single place, from which there is physically no escape. The construction of the giant transatlantic liner proved to be the perfect tool for solving this bloody task. The intricate trap for independent capital was practically ready for use. An unsuspecting world watched with naive, heart-stopping anticipation as the greatest technological marvel was launched into the water, completely unaware that this was not the crown of shipbuilding, but a meticulously designed floating scaffold, tickets to which would become a death sentence for those who dared to challenge the system. We are approaching the most sinister stage of our investigation, where the logic of facts finally displaces any randomness. Look at the list of passengers who booked places on the first voyage of the greatest ship, and you will see a picture that chills the blood in your veins. At the moment when it was necessary to eliminate the main political and financial opponents of the system, they all suddenly find themselves in one place at one time. John Pierpont Morgan, the man whose name is still synonymous with world banking dominance, the de facto owner of the company that built this liner, suddenly cancels his trip at the last moment. He cites a sudden illness, although just a few days earlier he felt perfectly fine and was actively conducting business. His influential banker partners follow his example. They return their tickets, freeing up seats for those whose death was critically necessary for implementing the plan developed on Jekyll Island.
This is no coincidence. It is calculation. The greatest maritime disaster in history was planned as a targeted elimination, where the main task was to send to the bottom of the Atlantic people capable of stopping the financial coup. The official version of events, which we have been fed for over 100 years, crumbles as soon as we ask the question, who benefited from this? Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss did not just perish in the cold water. Their deaths were a necessary condition for the successful takeover of the world financial system. When the ship collided with the iceberg, the rescue operation was conducted with such cynicism and negligence that it leads to only one conclusion. Rescue was merely a facade, and the goal was the complete elimination of the victims. Astor, one of the richest people on the planet, couldn't find a seat in a lifeboat? Guggenheim, whose capital could overturn any political alignment, simply drowned in the icy water, although he had every opportunity to survive. Strauss, whose influence terrified bankers to death, was doomed to perish despite his position. That night in the Atlantic, it wasn't just the pride of shipbuilding that sank. That night, the intellectual and financial elite that could have prevented the creation of the Federal Reserve System went to the bottom. Their deaths were written off as a tragic error, haste, panic. But we know that in the world of high politics and big money, there is no panic. There are only interests and their cold-blooded execution. Look at how events unfolded immediately after the news of the disaster spread around the world. The silence that followed the deaths of Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss was deathly. None of the survivors dared to link their deaths to the fight against the banking monopoly. Public opinion was skillfully directed toward pity, sympathy, and tears, reliably shielding the true beneficiaries of the tragedy. While the entire world mourned the deceased passengers, work in the offices of the United States of America boiled over with redoubled intensity. Without these three titans, who could stop the passage of any destructive law with a single phone call? Resistance to the banking cartels was finally crushed. They cleared their path by eliminating the most serious obstacles. It was pure, ruthless elimination of competitors, packaged in the wrapper of a natural disaster. Using icy water as a tool of murder allowed them to avoid any evidence, ballistic examinations, or signs of struggle. Nature did all the dirty work, while the bankers simply watched from their offices as their plan came to life without a single shot. This tragedy became the catalyst for the process that turned a free society into a system of total debt. The bankers got what they wanted, a complete monopoly on money issuance. By eliminating Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss, they received carte blanche to rewrite all the financial rules of the state. The official version tries to convince us that the disaster had nothing to do with the economy, but the documents say otherwise. In the months following the sinking of the Titanic, we see bills that had been blocked for decades suddenly passing through all government institutions at lightning speed. This is no coincidence. It is the result of targeted elimination of the opposition. The removal of the resistance leaders became the final chord in preparing to seize control over the entire money supply of the United States of America. The people who could have stopped the enslavement were physically eliminated, and the path to establishing a private financial dictatorship was completely clear. Think about how easily humanity can be manipulated if you control the narrative. The media of that time, controlled by the same bankers,
created a cult of the heroic death of the passengers. They turned murder victims into martyrs whose memory demands respect, not investigation. Anyone who dared to doubt the official version was declared a madman or a conspiracy theorist. This protective strategy still works today. When we expose the mechanism of creating the Federal Reserve System, we are told that these are dry economic facts, having nothing to do with some century-old catastrophe. But it was precisely at the moment when Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss went under the water that the independence of the financial system also sank. Their lives were sacrificed on the altar of impending global dominance. We must see through this glittering facade of tragedy. We must understand that behind every great historical event stand the interests of those who extract unimaginable profits from them.
That night at the bottom of the ocean, not only luxury and people's dreams remained, there remained the hope for a sovereign future, which was replaced by a cage of printed money and eternal interest, becoming our only law of survival in the modern world. This scenery is constructed so artfully that we still continue to play our roles in someone else's play without even suspecting that the tickets to this show were bought at the price of destroying the freedom of an entire world. The culmination of our large-scale investigation is approaching. Let's transport ourselves to December 1913. This time will forever enter world history as the point of no return, the moment when the greatest scam was finally legalized. The main competitors and unwavering defenders of independent capital are dead. Their bodies were swallowed by the cold abyss, and their colossal influence dissolved into oblivion. Now, nothing stood in the way of the hidden elites.
It was precisely at this moment that the ruthless mechanism of monetizing the tragedy was launched. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture became of how quickly and cynically the victors began dividing their spoils. The opposition was physically annihilated. Controlled chaos reigned in political circles, and the banking cartels delivered their main, crushing blow to humanity's financial freedom. They proceeded to implement that very plan, which had been developed in strictest secrecy on Jekyll Island in 1910. What just a few years earlier seemed like the insane ravings of a bunch of conspirators now took the form of an official state law. With incredible, suspicious haste, right on the eve of Christmas holidays, when public attention was maximally weakened, they pushed the Federal Reserve Act through the government of the United States of America. This is no coincidence. It is calculation. Let's break it down in absolutely simple language. What exactly happened on that fateful December day in 1913? The official version crumbles to dust when we are solemnly told with straight faces that the Federal Reserve System is a reliable government institution created solely to protect the economy from devastating crises. In reality, an unprecedented betrayal of national interests occurred. The sovereign, historic right of the state to print its own money was brazenly replaced by permission from a narrow group of private individuals. Imagine the full absurdity of the situation. A huge, great country possessing colossal resources, factories, and a hard-working population can no longer simply issue its internal currency. To get vitally necessary money into circulation, the government of the United States of America is obliged to come hat in hand to a private firm and borrow these freshly printed pieces of paper. And not just borrow them, but at a constantly dripping interest rate. Corporations and corporate banking cartels got into their greedy hands the most perfect monopoly of all possible. They create money literally out of thin air, out of absolute nothingness, simply by pressing buttons or running a printing press, and in return receive real debt obligations from an entire state and all its citizens. The system was mathematically designed from the outset so that the colossal debt to the bankers would be physically impossible to repay. If you borrow 100 bills, but are obligated to return 105, those 5 additional bills simply do not exist in nature, because the private bank hasn't printed them yet. This means you will inevitably have to take out a completely new loan just to pay the interest on the old one. This is an endless spiral from which there is no escape. But here arises an important question that reveals the devilish genius of this global scheme. How to guarantee that the state will always dutifully pay interest on these endless, growing loans?
How to make the system work eternally, without a single glitch. And it is here that we come right up to the main time bomb, which was ruthlessly detonated in that same 1913. To ensure an uninterrupted, stable flow of payments to private bankers, what we all perceive today as inevitable everyday evil is introduced at the legislative level: the mandatory income tax for all citizens. As soon as the elites need resources, they unhesitatingly reach into the pocket of the ordinary working person. It is necessary to clearly realize one astonishing historical fact. Before this pivotal moment in the history of the United States of America, ordinary people did not pay income tax on their personal daily labor at all. They received exactly the amount they honestly earned in their hands. But now, the rules of the game changed forever. The income tax was invented not at all to build new schools, pave smooth roads, or fund hospitals, as politicians falsely tell us. It was introduced with one single, cynical purpose: to guarantee the payment of interest on the state debt to the Federal Reserve System. The mechanism turned out to be terrifyingly simple. The state borrows cut paper from a private bank, and to pay the interest for using this paper, it is forced to legally rob its own citizens, taking a substantial part of their real labor. The trap finally slammed shut, and people instantly turned into eternal, rightless debtors. Every time you receive your salary and see that a significant amount was irrevocably withheld as taxes, know you personally are paying for that very grand banquet that was secretly ordered on Jekyll Island. Your personal labor, your priceless time, and vital energy are converted into taxes that are directed to service the astronomical debt created out of nothing by banking elites. This is the perfect model of modern economic slavery, in which the slaves are not even aware of the existence of their invisible chains. They sincerely believe that they are giving money for the benefit of society, while these giant funds flow straight into the pockets of banking cartels. This entire monstrous structure is held together solely by deception and hidden economic pressure. Without the introduction of income tax, the system simply could not exist, as the state would have no source to cover the debts. And that is precisely why the Federal Reserve Act and the income tax law were passed almost simultaneously. It was a double crushing blow that forever destroyed financial independence. If the influential opposition had safely disembarked in the spring of 1912, they would have blocked the creation of the private central bank. The icy water became the tool that allowed the credit noose to be thrown around the neck of every subsequent generation. We live in a world forged in that fateful December. The system feeds on our labor and reliably holds us in prison. We have come to the finale of our dark but vitally necessary journey through time, forgotten archival documents, and the hidden mechanisms of controlling modern society. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the picture became of this global, methodically constructed crime against all of humanity. The greatest maritime disaster of the early 20th century, immortalized in thousands of books, memoirs, and hundreds of high-budget Hollywood films, turned out to be not a story of overconfident engineering pride clashing with the merciless force of wild nature. It was a story of grand, calculated betrayal and cold-blooded, mass political murder.
The official version shatters into tiny, utterly untrustworthy fragments as soon as we stop blindly believing the imposed sentimental emotions and begin rigorously analyzing the dry economic facts, enacted laws, timelines, and global financial consequences. That icy giant in the dark, cold waters of the North Atlantic pierced not just the double steel hull of the most luxurious transatlantic liner of its time. It pierced a huge, gaping, and irreparable breach in the foundation of world financial independence. The Titanic dragged to the dark ocean bottom not only 1,500 innocent human lives and the main, most powerful opponents of the banking monopoly. It dragged to the bottom the very financial freedom of all humanity, forever burying under a several-mile-thick layer of salty water the beautiful era when money was an absolutely real, tangible value, not a virtual tool of total control. What happened in April 1912 became the zero point of reference for creating a completely new, artificial reality in which you and I are forced to exist from birth until death. It was the first, most brutal, and most successful global reset in modern human history, brilliantly executed by the hands of invisible puppeteers who preferred to remain in the shadows of their luxurious offices. Every time the hidden elites and powerful transnational corporations prepared to take away from us another substantial portion of basic civil rights and economic freedoms, they artificially organize a massive, society-shaking crisis or an unimaginable tragedy in its scale, so that under the reliable cover of universal fear, grief, and paralyzing panic, they can lightning-fast push through their own pre-prepared and meticulously crafted legislative solutions. The physical elimination of John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus was merely the first, but the most important and bloodiest chord in this monstrous, multi-year symphony of global enslavement. This is no coincidence, it is calculation. An absolutely strict, meticulously calibrated to the smallest detail, mathematical and ruthless calculation of the banking cartels, whose main and sole ultimate goal was absolute control over every produced material good on this planet. After the usurious Federal Reserve Act was hastily signed at the end of December 1913, the world changed irreversibly and forever. We, millions and billions of ordinary people, from full-fledged masters of our own fate, from independent creators and proud builders, in an instant turned into banal, expendable material of the system. We became an infinite, renewable resource that uninterruptedly ensures the well-fed, vital activity of this gigantic, insatiable, parasitic machine. The state, which historically was created to protect our interests and freedoms, finally turned into a strict and soulless overseer, whose main punitive function is to collect tribute from us in the form of income tax on time, without delays, and submissively transfer huge financial flows straight into the hands of the private owners of the world's printing press. We have all been tightly locked in an invisible but incredibly sturdy cage, the bars of which are forged not from cold iron, but from endless, unfulfillable credit obligations, constant inflation that eats away at savings, and artificially created economic crises. Look around right now and see the world in which you live. We exist in an artfully and meticulously created debt scenery, which, due to incredible naivety and long-term habit, we continue to mistakenly accept as the real, objective reality.
From the earliest childhood, we are persistently indoctrinated through all available information channels that taking usurious loans is absolutely normal, and even prestigious, that constant inflation is a natural and inevitable economic process that we just need to accept, and that regular, mandatory payment of taxes on our own hard labor is supposedly the highest manifestation of conscious civic responsibility.
The banking cartels, through the world media fully controlled by them, the academic education system, and the highest state institutions, have created a truly ideal matrix of obedience. In this neon-lit scenery, you are graciously allowed to choose the color of your car, the brand of your mobile phone, the type of morning coffee, or even a political candidate in the next formal elections. But you are categorically, and under threat of inevitable destruction, forbidden from choosing the very essence of the financial system.
Real political and economic power has long ceased to belong to elected presidents, sitting parliaments, or supreme courts. True, absolute power is indivisibly concentrated in the hands of those who have the exclusive, legally protected right to create money out of utter nothingness and lend it to entire sovereign states, such as the United States of America, at predatory interest rates that are purely mathematically and physically impossible to pay in full. Our entire modern, much-praised global economy is nothing more than a gigantic, intricate financial pyramid, the foundation of which was laid on the bones of those principled people who tried to stop it 100 years ago.
And every single day, waking up to the alarm clock and heading to work, we submissively give a part of our priceless vital energy, our precious, irreplaceable time, and our physical health, to keep this deceitful scenery in working order, enriching those whose names are never printed on the lists of the planet's richest people.